I want to bring in you in a moment, Greg, but I want to play for my viewers, if I can, some interesting comments from Dave Tollner. He's a former politician who, at the time the port was leased, was the treasurer in the NT.
Defence Department at the time signed off on it. We took it to the Defence Department. We made applications to take it to FIRB. FIRB looked at the Foreign Investment Review Board, looked at the application, determined that they had no reason to be looking at that at all. So it wasn't even considered by FIRB, but it was certainly considered by the Defence Department, and everything was given the all clear.
Right, at the time Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, Greg, Sheridan, what do you make of Tollner's comments there? And look, is there any way you can scrap this deal, do you think, without taxpayers paying out millions in the process?
No, Peter, it's great to be with you. I think, so one thing that Tollner says is rubbish, one thing that he says is right. The thing that he says is right is that the procedures which applied at the time were followed. So, as he says, Foreign Investment Review Board didn't routinely review state government privatisations at that time, and the Defence Department signed off on it. Now, you know, very good friends of mine in the Defence Department were involved at that time, but I think they made a terrible mistake. But we as a country cannot simply expropriate the property rights of a foreign investor without due compensation. We don't do that. We live under the rule of law, and if you invest your money in Australia, you get treated fairly. So should the government get to the point where it decides that it needs to resume control of the port or something like that, it will have to compensate Landbridge fairly. It'll have to pay them every cent that they paid for it, and it'll have to compensate them for costs and so on. And it could be quite expensive. It was a very bad decision at the time, and it led to a wholesale reform of our procedures for state government privatisations. The one thing that Tollner says that I think is rubbish is that the state government couldn't afford, the territory government couldn't afford to keep the port. So how is it an economic thing for a private company to lease if it's not economic for the government to keep it? Presumably there's a revenue stream, otherwise
Absolutely
the
right.
private company wouldn't have leased it.
Absolutely right. And of course, it's a territory, not a state, and there's a whole different governance framework there. So I don't buy what Tollner has said there on camera, unless there's a bit of revisionism going on. What about these comments that they were made last year, but we're aware of them now, from a former commander of Australia's Special Forces in relation to China? Pretty strong comments about the grey zone warfare and the likelihood of all-out conflict. It comes, obviously, we've heard from Mike Pizzullo, the head of the Home Affairs Department last week. There's many others out there. This is not new. These discussions about China have been happening in and around Canberra for some time. I guess they're coming, though, at a time when the relationship is at a low ebb. Take us through this term grey zone warfare, Greg, and what are we doing to push back in this area?
So the General's comments are very realistic, but I think Generals should be very careful about what they say. And if they were really closed-door comments, then doesn't fill you with confidence that the Defence Force or the Defence Department can protect its secrets. The grey zone is an area of conflict which China and Russia have really perfected, which is conflict below the threshold that triggers American response. They don't really care about anyone else's response because they think they can beat up anyone else. But so, you know, the Russians in Ukraine and in Crimea used people who were not dressed in Russian military uniforms so they could deny that they were actually Russian soldiers. The Chinese in the South China Sea use what are in effect Chinese Navy ships to conduct military operations, but they paint them a different colour and say they're Coast Guard vessels or something like this. The idea is that it's a quasi-military action. It might be a cyber attack or a direct military intervention at sea, typically against someone other than the United States, and with just enough plausible deniability that it won't provoke a United States response. It's done this against the Philippines, against Vietnam. So these are really Chinese military vessels, but they're painted Coast Guard colours. And then the Chinese just say, well, this is a civilian altercation. nothing military here. Whereas if they actually fired on a Philippines naval ship with their own navy, the Americans might respond because the Philippines are a military ally. It's extremely dangerous, extremely hard to respond to for a democratic nation.
I want to go to the issue of India. It's again dominated the headlines and a lot of commentary around the country. The PM is calling it not a border closure, but a pause. I picked up an interesting tweet this afternoon from CNN. It's in relation to World Health Organization data. They are saying, the World Health Organization, there has been more COVID cases reported in the past 2 weeks than in the first full 6 months of the pandemic. Now, a lot of support for the PM's move, a lot of upset, and quite rightly upset in the Indian community in Australia, in a sense that this created two classes of Australian citizenship. Greg, how do you think this is being managed here by the government?
Overall, I think the government has done really well in COVID, but I think this has been mismanaged. We are seeing new mutant strains of the virus in India, which seem to be more dangerous than previous strains. It's not unreasonable that the government be pretty cautious. But, you know, the Indians are an absolutely critical partner for Australia. You talk about China, after the United States and maybe Japan, there's no other nation in the world more critical to the response to China than India. The other thing is, India, I love it dearly, but it's not a place that is absolutely slow to take offence. Now, it's one thing to push back against a dictatorship which is giving you a hard time. It's another thing to gratuitously injure the feelings of your friends. I am baffled why that press release had to go out that night. Surely you could simply say you were pausing the return. Now, anyone who did sneak through a third country airport would still have to go into hotel quarantine. We've had 12 months of operating hotel quarantine. We know how to do it. We're dealing in an absolute sense with very small, very, very small numbers of people. I do think, so I'm not absolutely against the pause, although very soon you want to resume a situation where Australian citizens can come home. So I hate false accusations of racism, but I can understand Indians feeling a little aggrieved because Australian citizens in other nations have not been absolutely prevented lock, stock and barrel from coming home. I don't think it had to be, the government didn't have to be quite so chest-thumping about this in denying rights to Australian citizens and in offending our friends.
Yeah, less about the decision and more about how it's been handled. I think that's where most people are lining up at the moment. Greg Sheridan, thank you for your time.
Great to be with you, Peter.